It was in the winter of 1926 that the streets of Hollywood grew hushed beneath an unusual sorrow, for one of their own had passed into shadow. Crowds pressed close to glimpse the pale figure beneath glass, the star who had burned so fiercely that she seemed destined never to endure. They whispered the name that was more legend than truth, Barbara La Marr, the girl the world had already begun to call too beautiful to live. Welcome, dear listener. Before we begin, I invite you to share in the comments where and when you are listening, so we may together weave a quiet memory that spans across the world. And if you wish to keep company with these drifting tales of time, I invite you also to subscribe, so you may return again to the circle. The child who would one day be known to the world as Barbara La Marr was born far from the glamour and lights that would later envelop her. She came into the world on a warm July day in 1896 in Yakima, Washington, and was given the name Reatha Dale Watson. In those early days, the land itself was raw and untamed, orchards still young, fields smelling of earth after rain, the mountains always watching from the horizon. There was nothing to suggest that this infant, lying swaddled and quiet, would one day be a figure of myth and longing in the new empire of cinema. And yet, even from the beginning, there were whispers of restlessness, as if the winds themselves carried her forward. Her family did not stay long in Yakima. They moved often, their steps carrying them farther south, into California, where the light was harsher and the air was filled with dust and oranges. Childhood for Reatha was not marked by stability, but by constant shifting, the sense that the ground could never quite hold still beneath her feet. Perhaps this early drifting sowed in her the seed of movement, of never remaining long in one place, of seeking something more than the present offered. For even as a girl, she was said to vanish for hours, wandering or slipping away from home, leaving those who searched for her with worry and with wonder. There are stories preserved in local papers of her running away as a child, walking long miles until she was found. Some called it rebellion, others curiosity. But perhaps it was simply the deep desire of a spirit that could not be tethered. What lies in the heart of a young soul that makes her restless before she has even grown tall? Was it loneliness? Was it hunger? Or was it the unnameable pull of destiny? Those who saw her remembered a girl with striking eyes, already filled with something older than her years, already bearing the air of one who belonged elsewhere. Her father, William Watson, and her mother, Rose, may have wondered what to do with such a child, one who did not easily bend to rules. Yet in their own way they indulged her brightness. California was itself a land of reinvention, and in its sun, Reatha's imagination grew. She would dance for her sisters, invent scenes, slip into poses of queens and adventurers, her bare feet dusty from the yard. Even then she seemed to believe she could step out of her own skin and become another being entirely. And perhaps this was her first taste of the transformation that would later define her life. The power of stepping beyond the self, of choosing a name and a face to suit the moment. But youth, like the seasons, is never still. As the years stretched, her family's movements continued. They passed through towns, through schools, through neighbors who remembered only a fleeting glimpse of the Watson girl. There was little of settled education, little of roots. What she gained instead was a sense of impermanence, a rhythm of constant departure. Some would say this shaped her fate, making her both alluring and unstable, always present and yet never entirely belonging. The girl who had no firm ground would become the woman who could be anyone and everyone until she was lost within her own masks. And always, above the shifting rooftops of California, above the orange groves and rail tracks, stretched the night sky. She is remembered as standing at windows and gazing upward, as though she could see there not only the constellations, but some secret map of her own life written in stars. The restless energy that kept her wandering by day seemed to find no peace at night. Perhaps she asked herself then the same questions we whisper now. What lies beyond? What future is waiting? What shape will beauty and desire carve into the life of one so young? The child Reatha, born in Yakima, carried within her something both ordinary and extraordinary. She was of the earth, of fields and dust, yet already she seemed to listen for a music that others could not hear. It was a music that would lead her and mislead her across years filled with brightness and shadow. It was still faint then, like a distant melody carried on the wind, but she followed it, even before she had words to name it, her eyes wide and her feet already seeking the next horizon. And so her childhood moved forward, not as a tale of calm domestic growth, but as a series of fragments, glimpses of a girl who was always half vanished, always on her way toward something unseen. Her name was still Reatha. Her family still held her close, but the night sky above her seemed to wait, patient, as though it already knew that this child would not remain who she was for long. The stars hung silently above, their cold light spilling over orchards and rooftops, watching her restless steps as she moved into the uncertain paths of adolescence. The night sky lingered over orchards and fields, its pale light pressed gently upon the rooftops of California. But beneath that canopy of stars, another sound began to seep into the world of the young girl, who was still Reatha Watson. It was the far and hollow whistle of trains, carried across the distances by the night air. The sound seemed both mournful and inviting, like a summons to some distant realm where the past could be discarded and the self reshaped. And in time, Reatha herself would step into the current of that sound, letting it guide her into new names, new lives, and new scandals that unfolded one after another, like stations on an endless track. Adolescence came, and with it a sharpening of her features that startled those around her. She was not simply pretty in the way of young girls, but already carried something more dangerous, a beauty that seemed fully formed before her youth was done. There was a fullness in her lips, a darkness in her gaze, that unsettled teachers and neighbors alike. They looked at her and saw not innocence, but the shadow of something older, something already steeped in longing. Beauty like this is often a burden, for it draws eyes before the soul is ready to bear their weight. Reatha felt that gaze upon her, and rather than hide, she leaned into it, as though her very spirit were daring the world to acknowledge her. The newspapers of California in those years occasionally made mention of her, not as a child prodigy or a scholar, but as a figure of scandal. Stories circulated of her running away once more, not merely to wander, but to elope, still scarcely beyond girlhood. The details shifted with each retelling, and even now no certainty remains. Some claimed she had married, others that she had only fled for adventure. Yet the pattern became clear. Her life would not be confined by expectations. Rules, contracts, the ordinary paths of women of her time, all seemed to her like invisible chains she must break. She began to call herself by other names. One of them, whispered with growing frequency, was La Marr, taken from a stepfather whose presence in her life was fleeting, yet whose name she seized upon as if it contained a promise of reinvention. La Marr, foreign in its cadence, suggestive of distant lands, of Europe, of romance. No longer simply Reatha Watson of Yakima in California, she was beginning to draft the outline of the legend she would later embody. Is it not remarkable how a syllable can change the way a face is seen? How a borrowed name can open doors closed to the ordinary? And yet, beneath the borrowed syllables, the same restless heart remained, still seeking something beyond reach. The years carried her into her late teens, and with each passing season, the whispers about her multiplied. She moved in and out of towns, was seen with men older than herself, vanished again into journeys half explained. The public's fascination grew not because she was already famous, but because she was already a story, a tale to be told across parlors and printed columns. In this, she seemed to anticipate her later stardom. Before she was known on screen, she'd already made her life a performance, half true, half invention. Was it the world that demanded scandal of her? Or was it she who crafted scandal to satisfy the world? The line is delicate, and perhaps it never can be drawn with certainty. California itself was changing in those years, the hum of industry, the growth of towns, the promise of cinema already being whispered in scattered theaters. Yet even before she entered the industry, she seemed to embody the spirit of that place, a land where reinvention was not only possible, but expected. The orchard could become a boulevard, the drifter could become a mogul, and the girl named Reatha could become Barbara La Marr. Destiny, it seemed, was not something written, but something performed, shaped, and reshaped as often as one dared. But such transformations come with cost. In the fleeting marriages and dissolving romances of her youth, one can already trace the sorrow that would later define her. She sought love, or perhaps only freedom, but what she found was impermanence, the constant ending before any true beginning. It is easy to think of these as reckless acts of a restless youth, yet might they also have been a cry for something she could never name? The human heart often cloaks its deepest need in patterns of destruction. Her beauty by now was undeniable. Even in modest dresses in small towns far from the great stages, she drew attention like a flame draws moths. Yet beauty, when too visible too soon, can be a dangerous inheritance. It places burdens upon the spirit, demands that cannot be met, and it isolates as much as it attracts. One imagines her at night, standing once again at a window, the whistle of a distant train in her ears, wondering if somewhere else, under some other name, she might at last feel at home. The years of adolescence thus left her not with stability, but with a reputation, a trail of half-remembered episodes that already hinted at tragedy. She was not the dutiful daughter, not the sheltered young woman. She was already the girl the world whispered about, the one who ran away, who married too young, who changed her name, who seemed unable or unwilling to remain still. And through all of it, the train whistle carried across the night, a symbol of flight and return, of departure and longing. Did she hear it as an omen, as a promise, or merely as the sound of the life she had already chosen? Thus the girl who began as Reatha Watson entered her early adulthood, not with peace, but with turbulence. Her identity already fractured and reassembled, her story already filled with rumor. She was on her way toward the stage, toward the flickering screens, toward the glamour that would consume her. But in those nights when the air was quiet and the stars shone faint above the groves, the sound that lingered most clearly was still the wail of the train, pulling her toward the next unknown station in her life. And the whistle lingered in the darkness, stretching into the silence, as though the earth itself were calling her onward. The whistle of the train echoed into the night, until at last it dissolved into silence. Yet from that silence arose another sound, one that would soon become as familiar to her as the beat of her own heart. It was the sound of applause, distant at first, scattered, uncertain, but growing with each gesture, each step, each turn she offered upon the stage. In the low-lit theaters of California, beneath the cracked plaster ceilings and the faint smell of perfume and smoke, the girl who was once Reatha, who now leaned more and more toward the name La Marr, began to taste the intoxicating power of performance. She started, as so many did, with small appearances, in vaudeville acts where laughter mingled with sighs, and in dancing troupes that passed from one town to the next. It was not yet stardom, not yet the vast reach of the cinema screen, but it was a beginning. On those stages, where the boards creaked beneath her feet and the orchestra played hurried tunes from the pit, she discovered how a face could transform, how a body could speak without words, how the audience's eyes could be made to follow her with something like longing. Applause is more than noise. It is a kind of recognition, a confirmation that one has stepped beyond the ordinary into a realm of shimmering possibility. And yet, applause is also fleeting. It dies as quickly as it rises, leaving behind a hush that feels emptier than before. She must have felt this acutely, the need to chase again that thunder of hands, that brief, intoxicating assurance that she was seen, that she existed not only in the shadows of rumor, but in the light of collective desire. Perhaps this was why she pressed further, deeper into performance, why she sought out the stage whenever she could, why she lingered near the doorways of theaters as though they were temples. Her beauty, already a source of fascination and unease, became here both her gift and her trap. Directors and producers looked upon her with interest, audiences leaned closer to catch a glimpse, and yet what they demanded of her was often shallow, reduced to the sway of her figure, the gleam of her eyes, the curve of her lips. Did she know then that she was beginning a dance with forces that would later consume her? Or did she feel only the rush, the heady sense that she was no longer the restless girl of Yakima and California's drifting towns, but someone else entirely? Someone forged upon the stage and adored for it? The theaters were small, yet in her imagination they must have seemed vast. The flickering lights, the smoke curling in the air, the laughter and murmurs of the crowd, all of it wove a world in which she could shed the weight of her unsettled youth. The stage, unlike the home she had never truly known, gave her a kind of belonging. Yet belonging bought with performance is precarious. It vanishes the moment the curtain falls. Perhaps that is why she learned so early to reinvent, to shift, to craft new masks. If one role ended, another awaited. If one name grew tired, another could be conjured. By this time, whispers of her beauty had already reached beyond the immediate theaters. Men followed her with their eyes. Women spoke of her with envy or caution. There was a magnetism about her, one that could not be entirely explained by features alone. It was as though she carried with her the memory of those restless wanderings of childhood, the sense that she could not be contained. To watch her was to feel that she belonged to no one, not even to herself. And in that mystery, fascination grew. Her movements across the stage, the grace with which she entered and left impressions not easily forgotten. There is something almost sacred in the way certain performers inhabit the moment. They leave the audience unsure of what they have seen, only certain that it has stirred something deep. Barbara, or Rayatha still, though less so with each passing year, was already cultivating that sacred ambiguity, but with it came temptation. The nights after the show stretched long, filled with admirers, with parties, with glasses raised in smoky rooms. She was still young, still forming, but already the world was offering her its dangerous gifts. Excess, attention, fleeting affections, all of these followed her like shadows, and she, ever restless, ever eager for the next horizon, did not always turn them away. What, after all, is the difference between applause in a theater and admiration whispered in a darkened parlor? Both are forms of recognition, both promise belonging, and yet both leave emptiness when the sound fades. It is said that in these years she began to write as well, dabbling in scenarios, in stories that would later find their way into the growing industry of film. The pen in her hand, stained with ink, was another stage, another mask. She was already more than what the audience saw, though the world seldom cared to notice. Even then she harbored the soul of an artist, not only an image. But the image was louder, brighter, more easily consumed, and so it became the cloak that covered her truest self. What lingers most from this chapter of her life is not the details of each performance, now lost to time, but the impression of a young woman standing beneath footlights, her features caught in the glow, the air trembling with applause. That sound rolling through her must have felt like destiny itself. And yet, how quickly it fades. Did she feel in the silence that followed the first shadow of the emptiness that would haunt her? Or did she simply prepare for the next entrance, the next transformation, the next borrowed moment of being seen? The applause grew softer as the years turned, but its echo never left her. It carried her onward, urging her toward bigger stages, toward the newly forming studios, toward the world of silent film that was beginning to call her name. She would follow it as faithfully as she had once followed the whistle of the train. And as the final claps died away, she lingered for a moment in the hush, listening to the faintest resonance, her heart already reaching for the next round of thunder. In that fading echo of applause, there was both promise and warning, though she could not yet tell which it would be. The sound of applause ebbed into silence, and when silence lingers too long, it often leaves behind traces that are harder to bear than the noise itself. For her, that hush sometimes felt like the weight of something left unfinished, something unsaid. And so, in those restless nights between performances, in rooms scented faintly of roses and tobacco smoke, there would sometimes be a letter left unopened upon a table. The envelope, plain and waiting, was a symbol of promises made and broken, of unions begun too quickly and dissolved even more swiftly. For Barbara, though still not yet the Barbara La Marr known to the world, but the girl who was Riatha, or La Marr, or any number of fleeting selves, marriage itself became another performance, another stage upon which her life unfolded with too much haste and too little stability. Her first marriage came early, too early, the details clouded by conflicting records and whispered rumors. Some said she was scarcely more than a child, barely beyond girlhood, when she entered into her first union. It was not unusual in those years for young women to marry young, but even so, there was something breathless and impulsive about her choice, as though she rushed into it with the same fervor that drove her to the stage. If applause promised belonging for a moment, perhaps marriage promised it for a lifetime. But lifetimes are longer than applause, and she found herself restless even within the vows she had spoken. The marriage ended, and soon another began. One after another, vows were taken, rings exchanged, papers signed, and then almost as swiftly, the bonds unraveled. 5 times she married, each time with a new name, a new promise, a new hope of permanence. Yet permanence was never her gift, and never her fate. The unopened letters on the tables, the lingering glances, the whispered arguments, they piled upon one another, leaving behind a trail of broken unions that seemed less like failures than like echoes of her deeper inability to remain still. One wonders what she sought in those marriages. Was it love, a genuine hunger to be cherished and understood? Or was it freedom she sought paradoxically within the structure of marriage itself? Freedom from loneliness, from the restless wanderings of her girlhood. Or perhaps she married because marriage was another form of reinvention, another mask she could wear, another opportunity to become someone else entirely. For each union, however brief, gave her a new role to play, a new self to inhabit. And yet, each time, the performance ended, and she was left with the silence that follows applause. The newspapers followed her movements even then, before she was truly famous, for the sheer scandal of her choices. Each marriage, each separation, became fodder for gossip, whispered with fascination and disapproval. In that disapproval lay a kind of fascination, for the world is often drawn to those who transgress its expectations. And Barbara, even in these early years, seemed destined to live in defiance of what was expected of a woman. She refused the quiet path, the settled hearth. She chose instead the storm, the constant whirl of passion and departure. Marriage, for her, was never a quiet binding, but a tempest. And yet, even as each tempest passed, she remained unbroken. She emerged from each dissolution not diminished, but somehow more radiant, as though each storm had only burnished the brightness of her legend. Was it resilience, or was it simply the illusion of resilience, the mask of a woman determined never to let the world see her falter? The truth lies hidden, perhaps even from herself, It is tempting to judge these choices as reckless, but perhaps they were simply inevitable for one who had never known stability, who had grown up with movement and impermanence as her only constants. For such a soul, perhaps marriage was never truly about permanence, but about the momentary possibility of it, the fleeting hope that, for a season, she might belong. And when that belonging dissolved, she moved on as she had always moved on, following the whistle of trains, the echo of applause, the scent of roses that faded too soon. The unopened letter on the table remains an image that lingers, a symbol of what was never resolved. Was it a letter from a husband who had already left her, or one she had already left? Was it an apology, a plea, a farewell? The details are lost to time, but the image endures. The plain envelope, its contents forever unknown, resting in silence, while she, restless as ever, prepared to step once more into the light of performance and possibility. From these early marriages, from these storms of passion and disillusion, she emerged with a reputation already marked by scandal. She was no longer merely the restless girl. She was becoming the woman the world would later call the bad girl of Hollywood. Yet the title, like the marriages, was only another mask, another way for the world to contain what it could not understand. She was not simply bad or good, reckless or innocent. She was something more complex, more elusive, a soul in constant flight. And so, as she left behind the unopened letter and the shadows of failed unions, she turned her gaze once more toward the stage, toward the flickering promise of the moving picture. For if marriage had not given her permanence, perhaps the screen would. If love had not anchored her, perhaps fame might. The air smelled once again of burning lamps and film reels, of grease paint and dust, of dreams waiting to be projected larger than life. She followed the scent as though it were a trail, and the curtain of her next act began to rise. The unopened letter remained behind on the table, silent and unread, while in the distance the sharp odor of the studio lamps filled the air, pulling her into a new world of light and shadow. The letter lay unopened upon the table, mute testimony to a union already fading, and yet beyond that silence, another world awaited. Its air was sharp with the acrid sweetness of burning studio lamps, a world where dust mingled with grease paint, and dreams seemed to shimmer just beyond the eye's reach. It was into this world that she stepped, the restless girl who had already lived so many fleeting lives. Hollywood was still young then, a place of promise and chaos, its edges rough, its center still forming. It was not yet the polished empire of later decades, but a strange frontier where almost anyone, with enough beauty, ambition, or audacity, might find themselves transformed into something larger than life. For Barbara, or Riatha, or La Marr, as names still shifted around her like veils, this new world was irresistible. She had already tasted the stage, already known the fleeting intoxication of applause. But the screen promised something different. It promised permanence, the possibility that one's image might linger beyond the moment, captured and replayed in light and shadow, repeated until it seemed eternal. In the darkened theaters, strangers might gaze upon her face again and again, long after the applause had ended, long after the letter had yellowed upon the table. For a soul as restless as hers, what greater promise could there be? She began modestly, as so many did, with small roles, often uncredited, her figure passing briefly across the screen before vanishing again. She worked also as a writer, crafting scenarios for films, her imagination spilling into stories that others would perform. There was in her both the desire to be seen and the desire to create, to shape the world of cinema, not only with her body, but with her mind. In this, she was unusual, for Hollywood of the early 20s was already beginning to confine women to certain roles, faces, bodies, symbols of allure, while men wrote and directed the tales. But Barbara reached across those lines, putting words to paper even as she learned how to move before the camera's unblinking eye. Her first appearances may not have drawn much notice from the larger world, but they were steps nonetheless, each one carrying her deeper into the current of fame. She appeared in shorts, in supporting parts, her beauty already marked as her most obvious quality. Directors saw her and thought not of subtlety, but of the way light clung to her face, of the way the curve of her form held the audience's gaze. Was she reduced by this, or was she empowered by it? Perhaps both, for beauty is both a gift and a cage. It opens doors, but it also traps the soul within the expectations of those who look. The studios themselves were makeshift kingdoms, filled with heat, noise, and experimentation. Cameras whirred with imperfect steadiness, directors barked instructions, and actors moved through scenes again and again, their sweat mixing with powder beneath the lights. Into this chaos she walked, carrying with her the poise of someone who had already reinvented herself many times. For others, Hollywood was a dream to be chased. For her, it was simply the next transformation, the next mask to be tried. And yet behind the mask, there was always the same restless soul, searching for permanence in a world made of shadows. Her beauty began to draw notice. Casting directors leaned forward, murmuring that she might hold the screen more powerfully than expected. She was given more lines, more close-ups, more chances to command attention. And with each chance, she delivered something that audiences could not quite look away from. It was not merely her features, though those were striking. It was something in the way she seemed to carry sorrow beneath her gaze, even when smiling, as though her very face bore the memory of things lost. The camera is merciless in its revelation, but for her, this was an advantage. It revealed not only her beauty, but the mystery behind it, and audiences felt they were glimpsing not simply a performer, but a woman marked by secrets. Off-screen, she continued to live as she had before, recklessly, passionately, always at the edge of scandal. But the difference now was that Hollywood itself thrived on scandal. The papers were eager to feed readers tales of stars whose lives seemed larger, wilder, more forbidden than their own. Barbara, with her multiple marriages and restless heart, gave them such tales with ease. And so, even as her career began to rise, her name appeared not only in film credits but in gossip columns. She was becoming both an actress and a legend. Her real life and her performed life woven together so tightly that neither could be separated from the other. In those early days of her screen career, she must have felt the rush of promise. Each role led to another. Each success opened a wider path. The lamps burned hot upon her, the cameras spun, and she became accustomed to the rhythm of production, of waiting, of performing, of being captured in celluloid frames. She was no longer the restless child gazing at stars. She was becoming the woman those stars seemed to have foretold. And yet, even in this ascent, one wonders if she already sensed the cost. For the screen grants permanence, but it also demands sacrifice. Of privacy, of peace, of the quiet spaces where the soul might rest. Still, in those early years, the promise outweighed the cost. She leaned into the light, allowed the cameras to shape her, allowed the applause to swell once more, this time not from a theater but from audiences scattered across the country. The applause was different now. It came not in thunder but in murmurs, in the growing hum of recognition, in the way strangers began to know her name. And though the applause of cinema is invisible, it is no less intoxicating. The smell of the burning lamps, sharp and unyielding, clung to her clothes, to her hair, to her very being. It became a part of her, a reminder of the world she had entered. And as she left the studio each evening, walking into the twilight where the air was cooler, she must have carried with her both exhilaration and unease. For the lamps burned hot, and one could not stand beneath them forever without feeling the scorch. The scent lingered in her hair, in her dresses, a constant reminder that she had stepped fully into a realm where shadows and light created truth. And in that lingering scent lay both promise and peril, pulling her deeper toward a destiny she could neither resist nor escape. The smell of burning lamps clung to her clothes as she stepped out of the studio into the twilight, and with it lingered another presence, more insistent, more enduring. It was the sound of the film reel spinning, that mechanical whirl which seemed almost like the turning of fate itself. In those reels her image was caught, and once caught it could be played again and again, her beauty preserved in flickering frames that passed before the eyes of strangers across the country. That whirring reel, steady and ceaseless, marked the moment when Barbara La Marr began to rise beyond the shadows of supporting roles into the full light of stardom. It was the early 1920s, and Hollywood was in its golden youth, a world still forming its myths. The silent screen demanded more than dialogue, for dialogue could not yet be heard. It demanded presence, a face that could hold the audience in thrall without a word. Barbara's face, luminous and expressive, seemed made for this new art. She carried in her gaze something that spoke directly to the soul, a mixture of allure and sorrow, of seduction and vulnerability. She was not the ingenue, not the innocent maiden, but something more dangerous, more compelling, a woman whose beauty could enchant and destroy in equal measure. Her first major roles revealed this power. In costume dramas and lavish melodramas, she was cast as the temptress, the femme fatale, the woman whose allure set stories in motion. Critics wrote of her as dazzling, of her beauty as overwhelming. Audiences flocked to see her not because they believed the stories in which she appeared, but because they wished to see her move across the screen, her every gesture heavy with suggestion. The reel spun, and with each turn her fame grew until she was one of the most recognized faces in Hollywood. And yet with fame came the first shadows of the curse her beauty carried. For beauty, once exalted, is also hunted. Photographers sought her out, columnists chronicled her nights, strangers whispered her name. She was not merely admired, she was consumed. Her image spread across newspapers, posters, gossip columns. She became, in the eyes of the world, not a woman, but an ideal. And ideals are merciless prisons. To be the girl too beautiful to live was not praise, but prophecy. On the screen, Barbara's performances glowed with a fire that seemed to come not from acting, but from something raw within her. She poured her restless spirit into her roles, and the audience sensed it. Her allure was not entirely crafted, it was lived, carried from her own storm-tossed life into the stories she played. This gave her performances a depth that many of her contemporaries lacked. Yet the price of such authenticity was steep, for when one gives too much of oneself to the screen, what is left for the self in private? The studios adored her, but they also feared her volatility. She was known to live recklessly, to appear at parties until dawn, to fall into romances that ended in scandal. The very qualities that made her mesmerizing on screen also made her unpredictable in life. And still, the audiences loved her. Perhaps they loved her more for it, sensing in her not a polished star, but a woman whose passion burned too brightly to be tamed. She became known as the Vamp, a figure both adored and condemned, the embodiment of desire and danger. Yet beneath this label lay something more complex. Barbara was not merely a figure of seduction. She was also a writer, an artist, a thinker who sought meaning in her work. But the world saw only her face, her body, her beauty, and reduced her to them. Did she resent this, or did she accept it as the inevitable price of stardom? Perhaps she felt both, in alternating moments of pride and despair. As the reels spun and her fame expanded, Barbara's life grew more entangled with Hollywood's darker currents. Nights of excess, of champagne and smoke, of whispered conversations in dim rooms became part of her rhythm. The same newspapers that praised her performances also chronicled her affairs, her late-night escapades, her fragile health. She was no longer simply an actress. She was a myth in the making, a symbol of Hollywood's beauty and its ruin. And yet, within the glow of her fame, there were moments of pure triumph. She stood in gowns of shimmering silk, jewels glittering at her throat, her face caught by the camera in poses that seemed eternal. Audiences adored her, directors sought her. For a brief, glittering span of years, she was at the very heart of the silent screen's allure, her name spoken alongside the greatest stars of her age. But even in triumph, there was an undertone of fragility. The same reel that preserved her also reminded her that time was passing. Beauty, the very foundation of her fame, was fleeting, and she knew it. Each role, each close-up, was both a celebration and a warning, a reminder that the screen could exalt her today and forget her tomorrow. In that tension, perhaps, lay the source of her haunting power. She knew, as few did, the precariousness of beauty, and she carried that knowledge in her eyes, letting it flicker through every performance. The reel spun on, steady, indifferent, capturing her in its whirring cycle. It cared nothing for her restlessness, her passions, her despair. It simply turned, frame after frame, immortalizing her while consuming her all the same. For cinema preserves even as it erases, making permanent the image while letting the woman beneath it fade. And so, as the reel continued to spin, Barbara stood at the height of her fame, radiant and adored, yet already shadowed by the curse of her own beauty. She had everything the world promised: fame, wealth, admiration. Yet even as she basked in the glow of the screen, one could sense the sorrow beneath, the knowledge that the reel never stops turning, that beauty never stops fading, that applause never truly fills the silence that follows. The reel spun on into the night, its steady rhythm like a heartbeat, drawing her ever deeper into the paradox of her stardom, until its whirring seemed to blend with the clicking of typewriters in distant rooms, where the gossip columns were already preparing her next headline. The reel spun on, its whirring soft as a pulse in the night, until it seemed to fade into another sound entirely, a sharper and more insistent rhythm. It was the clicking of typewriters, relentless and unyielding, their keys striking paper in offices where smoke hung heavy, and ink stained the fingers of men who earned their living by turning lives into stories. And it was her life now that spilled across those pages, her name hammered out in headlines, her beauty described in endless variations, her nights and choices twisted into columns that fluttered in newsstands from Los Angeles to New York. For Barbara La Marr, stardom on the screen could not be separated from scandal on the page, and soon the two became indistinguishable, one feeding the other until both consumed her. The tabloids adored her, for she offered them everything they required. She was striking to look upon, endlessly restless, and always present where whispers were born, at parties, in clubs, in the homes of men whose names carried weight. Her marriages, so many and so swift, gave them an easy narrative. The bad girl of Hollywood, reckless in love, unrepentant in her appetites. The ink on her wedding certificates had scarcely dried before rumors of their dissolutions began, and the columnists, eager for sensation, rarely bothered to separate truth from invention. Each article was another performance, another story with her at its center, though this time she was not the author nor the actress, but the subject. What must it have felt like to open a newspaper and find oneself reflected in a distorted mirror, to see private longings twisted into public entertainment? Some stars raged against such intrusions, others ignored them, but Barbara seemed almost to lean into them, as though scandal were yet another mask to be worn. She had always lived at the edges of expectation, had always courted risk and reinvention. Perhaps she felt that to be written about, even unkindly, was to be confirmed in her existence. Or perhaps, beneath the bravado, each headline left a mark, a bruise that deepened with repetition, The world loves to simplify, to take a complex soul and reduce it to a single phrase. For Barbara, that phrase became the bad girl. It carried with it a tone of condemnation, yet it was tinged with fascination. She was the woman who defied the rules of her time, who refused to confine herself to the narrow roles allowed women of her era. She lived openly, passionately, destructively, and in doing so, she both scandalized and enthralled. Was she reckless, or was she simply unwilling to deny the hunger of her spirit? Was she immoral, or was she a mirror held up to a society that demanded virtue while secretly craving transgression? The typewriters clattered, but the answers remained elusive. Her beauty, always her greatest gift and curse, made every scandal larger than life. A plain woman might have gone unnoticed. Barbara could not. The camera had already taught audiences to see her as a symbol of desire, and the newspapers extended that image into her real life. She was the vamp, the temptress, not only on screen but in every whispered story of her affairs. And yet those who knew her spoke also of her kindness, her generosity, her fragility. Rarely did those truths find their way into print. The world preferred its myths. Nights in Hollywood grew long in these years. There were parties lit by chandeliers where champagne flowed and laughter rang out against the backdrop of jazz bands. Barbara was often there, her gowns shimmering, her presence magnetic. Men vied for her attention, women watched her with admiration or envy, and the air seemed charged when she entered a room. But behind the laughter, behind the glamour, lay exhaustion. Excess is a glittering mask, but beneath it the body falters. She danced, she drank, she loved, she quarreled, and then she would return home, the silence pressing close, the typewriters still clattering in the distance, ready to turn the night into the next morning's scandal. The typewriter, for all its noise, leaves behind silence. The sheets of paper, filled with words, fluttered into stacks, then into newspapers, then into the hands of readers who consumed her life as entertainment. And Barbara, caught between performance and reality, could not escape. Her real life bled into her roles, and her roles bled back into her real life, until both seemed part of the same endless tale. She was the girl too beautiful to live, and the papers reminded her of it again and again, each keystroke another nail in the story being built around her. There is a cruelty in such fascination, for it delights in watching the slow unraveling of its subject. The more the world adored her, the more it seemed to hunger for her destruction. And Barbara, perhaps sensing this, played her part with both defiance and resignation. She gave them scandal, she gave them beauty, she gave them everything they demanded. But in doing so, she gave away pieces of herself, fragments that could never be reclaimed. One wonders what she thought in her quiet moments, when the lamps were dimmed and the voices of admirers had faded. Did she ever dream of silence, of anonymity, of a life beyond the typewriter's reach? Or was the applause, whether on stage, on screen, or in gossip columns, too powerful to renounce? The questions linger, like smoke in a room long after the fire has gone out. The clatter of the typewriters echoed into the night, steady and merciless, until it seemed indistinguishable from the sound of glasses breaking upon marble floors in the midst of revelry. Another fragment of her restless life turned into story before she could even live it. The typewriters clattered until their rhythm seemed to merge with another sound, sharper, closer, the shattering of a glass upon marble. For a moment there is only silence, then a ripple of laughter, music resuming, the party continuing as though nothing had been broken at all. In such moments one sees the essence of Barbara La Marr's world in the early 20s. Brilliance, noise, excess, and yet beneath it a fragility that could crack at any moment, leaving only shards upon the floor. The parties of Hollywood in those years were themselves like performances. Ballrooms glowed beneath chandeliers, smoke hung in curling tendrils above heads, and the scent of perfume mingled with the sweetness of champagne. Jazz bands played with feverish energy, couples swirled across floors, and in the midst of it all was Barbara, her gowns shimmering with sequins, her eyes catching light as though they themselves were stars. To see her enter a room was to feel the atmosphere change. She carried with her the aura of a woman both worshipped and whispered about. Admirers crowded near her, voices low, glances bold. She gave laughter, gestures, and glances in return, each one unforgettable, each one destined to find its way into a column or a memory. Yet nights of excess carry their own weight. Behind the glitter, behind the swirl of gowns and the echo of music, there lay fatigue. The champagne that flowed so freely was not always celebration. Sometimes it was a balm, sometimes a shield against the emptiness that followed. Barbara, restless and untamed, sought in those nights not only pleasure, but distraction, a way to quiet the silence that so often waited for her in the hours before dawn. The parties offered noise, and noise can be easier to bear than stillness. It was during these years that whispers of addiction began to cling to her as persistently as perfume. Some spoke of her drinking, others of substances that dulled pain or heightened sensation. The truth is difficult to know, for gossip often grows from shadows rather than facts. Yet her health, already fragile, began to falter. She fainted on sets, grew thin, her body rebelling against the pace she demanded of it. Excess takes its toll not at once but slowly, and in Barbara's case it came as a slow erosion, visible in her eyes even as her beauty continued to captivate. Still, the world adored her. The studios presented her as the embodiment of glamour. Photographers captured her in luminous poses, and audiences filled theaters to see her perform. On screen, she was radiant, her allure undiminished. Off-screen, she was infamous, her nights of revelry fueling headlines. Together, these two selves formed a paradox: the woman adored and envied for her beauty, and the woman consumed by the very excess that beauty invited. Was she a victim of Hollywood's relentless hunger, or was she simply following the path her own restlessness demanded? Perhaps both. For in her life, the line between choice and fate is impossible to draw. Her homes became as restless as her heart. Lavish apartments, rented houses, each filled with ornate furnishings, silken drapes, and the constant flow of guests, admirers, and companions. Yet none of these homes seemed to anchor her. They were places of passage, backdrops for evenings of laughter and mornings of fatigue. In every corner of her life there was motion, noise, and extravagance, but rarely stillness. To some, she appeared enviable, living in a world of glamour and indulgence. To others, she appeared tragic, her beauty masking a deep loneliness. Both may have been true, and perhaps she herself could not distinguish which truth she lived from moment to moment. The newspapers loved to describe her parties, to linger over the details of her gowns and her jewels, to hint at the secrets of her affairs. Yet rarely did they speak of the toll it took upon her, the weariness that deepened in her face, the tremor in her hands. To the world she was still the bad girl of Hollywood, the temptress, the figure who lived too fully, too recklessly. The truth that such living was breaking her was less enchanting, less easy to sell. And so the myth grew, while the woman behind it dwindled. In the midst of this, Barbara continued to work. Her films demanded her presence, demanded that she set aside exhaustion and appear radiant before the camera. And she did. She gave to the screen all that she had, perhaps more than she had. In each performance, one sees not only the actress, but the cost, the fragility beneath the allure, the shadow beneath the light. She played roles of seduction, of betrayal, of sorrow, and each seemed to echo her own life. It is as though she could not separate art from existence, as though every line and gesture was another fragment of herself given away. The excess of those years was not only her own, but part of a larger world. Hollywood itself was intoxicated, reckless, its stars rising and falling in rapid succession, its nights filled with scandal and celebration. She was both participant and symbol, embodying the city's brilliance and its ruin. To speak of Barbara La Marr is also to speak of Hollywood's golden youth, a world too radiant, too careless, too fragile to last. And yet, for all the shadows, there were moments when she seemed to shine more brightly than ever. On nights when the music played and laughter rang out, she moved as though weightless, her smile lighting the room, her eyes holding stories no one could fully read. Those who saw her remembered her not only for her beauty, but for the aura she carried, a sense that she lived on a different scale, that her joys and sorrows alike burned hotter than those of others. Perhaps this was her gift and her curse, to feel more deeply, to burn more brightly, to live more recklessly than those around her. The glass shattered on marble, and though laughter smoothed over the moment, the shards remained, glinting in the light, silent reminders of fragility amid excess. They lay scattered long after the music resumed, and in their reflection one could glimpse both the glamour and the ruin that defined her. And the shards, catching the glow of chandeliers, gleamed like fragments of ink-stained fingertips as she turned once more to writing, to stories that carried within them another piece of her hidden self. The shards of glass upon the marble floor gleamed faintly in the light, like scattered stars that had fallen too close to earth. And when she bent to gather herself after such nights, there was often ink upon her fingertips, a different kind of stain, not of champagne or smoke, but of thought pressed into paper. For though Barbara La Marr was remembered by many only for her beauty and her scandals, there was within her a quieter ambition, one that reached beyond the mirror and the screen. She wished not only to be gazed upon, but to be heard, to shape stories rather than merely embody them. And so she wrote, her pen scratching across paper as the rest of the world slept or celebrated. The beginnings of her writing came early, before her fame had fully bloomed, when she found work crafting scenarios for silent films. In those days, scripts were not the rigid documents they would later become, but outlines of possibility, frameworks upon which directors and actors built. Barbara's imagination spilled into these outlines, giving life to dramas and romances that others performed. She signed them not with her true name, but with the names she had already gathered around herself, identities she shifted through like costumes. In this, writing offered her both freedom and secrecy, the ability to create without being wholly exposed, to give shape to stories while remaining unseen. Yet even as her fame grew, she continued to write, as though it were a tether to something more real than the parties and the headlines. On set, between takes, she scribbled in notebooks. At home, amid the silence after the revelry, she returned to her pages. For a woman so defined by her outward appearance, the ink on her fingers was a quiet rebellion, a reminder that she was more than her face, more than her beauty. Writing gave her a way to speak in her own voice, to leave behind something that was not merely an image flickering in darkness, but words that carried her own thought. Some of her scenarios found their way to the screen. Films like The Mother of His Children, 1920, bore her imprint, though audiences seldom knew her role in their creation. To most, she was simply the actress, the vamp, the bad girl of Hollywood. Few recognized the woman bent over paper, eyes intent, weaving stories out of the fragments of her own restless life. And yet those who did know her often spoke of her intelligence, of her wit, of her hunger to create. She was not content to be a vessel for others' imaginations. She sought to craft her own. There was a melancholy in this part of her life, for though she wrote, and though her words found form in films, her identity as a writer was always eclipsed by her identity as an actress and a scandalous beauty. The world, it seemed, could not hold both truths at once. And so her writing, though real and meaningful, became another shadowed aspect of her existence, half seen, half forgotten. Perhaps she knew this, and perhaps that knowledge made her press the pen more urgently, as though to leave behind some trace of herself that would outlast the fading of her beauty. Her films in these years were demanding, the roles larger, the schedules relentless. Yet even in exhaustion, she returned to her pen. The ink stains on her hands were not accidents, but badges, quiet testimony to the part of her that remained unseen. How many of those stories reflected her own longing, her own sorrows? How many of them were attempts to make sense of the contradictions of her life, the glamour and the emptiness, the adoration and the loneliness? Silent films could never speak aloud, but in her writing she found a voice, one that whispered truths the screen could not show. And yet, just as she poured herself into her roles, so too did she pour herself into her words, giving more than she could afford. To create is to bleed in another form, and Barbara had already been bleeding into her performances, her beauty, her very existence. The writing was another drain, another offering of herself to a world that would never fully recognize the depth of her gift. But she continued, because to stop would have been to lose something essential. For all her excess, for all her recklessness, she carried within her a core of artistry, a need to make, to shape, to leave behind. One wonders what she might have written had her life not been cut short, had her health endured, had the world granted her time. Might she have become a screenwriter remembered alongside the greats, a woman who gave voice as well as face to the silent age? Or would the world have continued to see only her beauty, leaving her words unread? Such questions linger, unresolved, like the fragments of glass upon the marble floor, like the ink stains upon her skin. Still, for a time, she managed both, to shine upon the screen and to write in the shadows. The paradox deepened. The world consumed the vamp, the seductress, the scandal. She herself returned to her pages, seeking something truer, quieter, more lasting. Between the two selves she stretched thin, her body weakening, her spirit restless. And yet, she continued, because to stop would have been to surrender, and surrender was not in her nature. The ink dried upon her fingertips, dark against her skin, even as her body began to betray her. The pace of filming, the endless nights, the strain of beauty maintained at all cost, these began to weigh heavily. She collapsed on sets. Her health faltered, but she pressed on, unwilling or unable to rest. To rest was to vanish, and she had spent her whole life running from vanishing. The ink, the quiet trace of her inner life, stained her hands as the sound of her faint heartbeat began to rise in the silence, soft and uncertain, a rhythm fragile and fleeting beneath the glamour. The ink dried upon her fingertips, its dark trace lingering even as she set the pen aside, and in the stillness that followed, there came another sound, soft and almost hidden, the faint beating of her heart. It was not the triumphant rhythm of applause, nor the steady whirring of the reel, but something fragile, uneven, as though her body itself had begun to protest against the weight she placed upon it. The heart that had carried her through restless childhood wanderings, through marriages and scandals, through stages and studios, now faltered under the strain of a life lived too intensely. By the early 1920s, Barbara was working constantly, her beauty in high demand, her presence requested in one film after another. The studios knew that audiences came to see her, and they pressed her to appear again and again, often without pause. Production schedules were grueling, lights hot and merciless, hours long. For others, it was difficult. For her, already fragile, it was perilous. Yet she seldom refused. To decline was to risk fading from the screen, and fading was the fate she feared most. So she gave herself to the work, though each performance seemed to draw more from her than the one before. On set, her colleagues began to notice moments when her strength seemed to give way. She would grow pale, her body trembling beneath the heat of the lamps. At times she fainted, crumpling suddenly in the midst of rehearsal, the camera's halted crew rushing to her side. There were whispers that her health was failing, that her nights of excess and her restless spirit were catching up to her. Some blamed the pace of the studios, others her indulgences. But whatever the cause, the effect was clear. Her body was weakening, even as her face remained luminous before the camera. Illness is not always visible, and for Barbara it seemed to appear only in glimpses, flashes of fragility before she gathered herself again. She would rise, smile, insist that she was well, and continue as though determination alone could force her body to obey. Perhaps she believed it could. Perhaps she believed that sheer will, the same will that had driven her through scandal and reinvention, could conquer the weakness that threatened her. But the body does not bend so easily. Each collapse was a reminder, each fainting a signal that something deeper was unraveling. And yet before the camera, she remained radiant. The audience saw none of the trembling, none of the weakness. They saw only the vamp, the star, the figure whose gaze could set hearts aflame. This was the paradox of her existence. The screen immortalized her at her most beautiful, while off-screen her strength slipped away. To the world she was still untouchable. To herself she was already fragile. The strain of fame is not only physical, but also spiritual. To be adored by millions yet known by none, to have every gesture watched yet every truth ignored. This erodes the soul. Barbara, who had long lived as performance, found herself trapped within the roles others demanded of her. The studios wanted glamour, the tabloids wanted scandal, the audiences wanted beauty. There was little room left for the woman beneath, the writer with ink-stained fingers, the soul who longed for something steadier than applause. And so she pushed on, even as exhaustion hollowed her, because to stop would be to vanish, and vanishing was a fate worse than death for one who had fought all her life to be seen. Her health continued to falter. Doctors murmured of tuberculosis, of nephritis, of conditions worsened by exhaustion and excess. She listened, perhaps, but listened only briefly. Rest was prescribed, but rest was impossible. To rest was to fall behind, to fade from memory, to be replaced by another face more youthful, more radiant, less troubled. And so she endured, masking her weakness with gowns and jewels, with laughter at parties, with performances on screen. Yet the mask grew heavier with each passing month, and behind it the faint heartbeat grew weaker. One imagines her alone in her room after long days of filming, the lamps extinguished, the silence pressing close. Perhaps she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the uneven rhythm, knowing in some hidden part of herself that her body could not carry her much longer. Did she fear it? Or did she accept it as part of the fate she had always seemed to carry? That one so beautiful, so restless, so reckless, could not expect a long life? The world had already begun to call her too beautiful to live. Did she begin to believe it herself? Still, she worked. Films such as The Three Musketeers, 1921, and The Prisoner of Zenda, 1922, brought her greater recognition, placing her alongside the great names of the silent era. Her screen presence was undeniable. Audiences adored her. Critics praised her. She seemed to grow brighter even as she weakened, as though her flame, knowing it would not last, burned more fiercely in its final years. The contrast was striking. The radiant star upon the screen and the fragile woman behind it, struggling to breathe, to stand, to endure. It is in these years that the tragedy of Barbara La Marr crystallizes. She had achieved the dream that so many sought, had risen from restless obscurity into stardom. Yet the very dream consumed her, demanded more than her body or spirit could give. The applause thundered, but each clap seemed to draw another beat from her weakening heart. Fame, for her, was both fulfillment and destruction, a crown too heavy for the one who wore it. The faint heartbeat echoed, soft and uncertain, beneath the glamour, beneath the applause. It was the sound of a body carrying too much, of a life lived too fiercely. And as it faltered, there was another sound quieter still, the creak of a rocking chair where a child's toy swayed gently, waiting, as though reminding her of a love she had long sought but never fully found. The faint heartbeat lingered in the silence, uncertain and unsteady, and beside it another sound arose, soft yet insistent, the creak of a rocking chair, the gentle sway of a child's toy left waiting in the dim light of a room. In that simple sound lay the echo of a longing Barbara La Marr had carried for many years, the hunger for something more enduring than applause, more intimate than scandal, more tender than desire. For behind the glittering image of the vamp, behind the laughter at parties and the relentless flicker of cameras, she bore the deep and quiet wish to be a mother. By the early 1920s, her health was already fragile, her body taxed by years of excess and by the ceaseless demands of work. Doctors warned her that to bear a child herself would be too dangerous, that pregnancy might take from her what little strength she still possessed. For a woman who had lived so recklessly, so defiantly, this warning was perhaps the first boundary she could not cross. And yet her longing did not diminish. To love a child, to care for one life without performance, without mask, that was a desire no physician's warning could erase. In 1923, she chose another path. She adopted a baby boy, whom she named Marvin Carville La Marr, though in later years he would be known as Dawn Gallery. The adoption was shrouded in mystery, like so much of her life. Some whispered that the child was in fact her own, born in secrecy, his true parentage concealed. Others claimed he was adopted through more conventional means, though even these accounts vary. The truth remains elusive, but perhaps the truth mattered less to Barbara than the presence of the child himself. For in his face, in his small hands, in the sound of his breathing, she found something she had long sought: permanence, belonging, the chance to give love rather than only to seek it. She was often seen with the child in her arms, her beauty softened by the tenderness of motherhood. Those who had known her as restless, scandalous, reckless, were surprised by the gentleness she showed him. It seemed to reveal a different Barbara, one not defined by excess or desire, but by devotion. For all her flaws, for all her storms, she poured into that child a love that was perhaps the purest part of her being. He was, as she once said, the only real romance of my life. And yet even this joy was shadowed by her fragile health and by the relentless glare of Hollywood. To raise a child within the world she inhabited was no simple matter. She tried to shield him, to keep their bond private, but the papers could not resist. They speculated on his origins, questioned her ability to care for him, turned her motherhood into another spectacle. In their eyes, she was not a mother but a scandalous star, and scandal could not be trusted with innocence. Barbara, for her part, seemed both wounded and defiant. She clung to the boy with even greater devotion, as though to prove that whatever else she had been, she could be true in this. There is a poignancy in this chapter of her life, for it reveals the yearning that had driven her all along. Beneath the beauty, beneath the restless reinventions, beneath the nights of excess, there had always been a hunger for love that was steady, unquestioning, enduring. In her son, she found a glimpse of that love, and yet the tragedy lay in the fragility of her own body, in the brevity of the time she would be given with him. She gave him what love she could, but the years allowed to her were few. Still, in those brief years, she seemed to find a measure of peace. The child became her anchor, a reason to endure the strain of filming, the endless demands, the illnesses that crept ever closer. When she faltered, she looked at him and found the strength to continue. When she doubted, she held him and remembered why she must not give in to despair. He was, in a sense, the only part of her life not defined by performance. With him, she did not have to be the vamp, the scandal, the star. She could simply be a mother, holding her child as the rocking chair creaked softly in the twilight. And yet, even this sanctuary could not protect her from the erosion of her health. Each year she grew thinner, paler, her body struggling beneath the weight of her existence. The doctors pressed her again to rest, to withdraw from the screen, but how could she? The boy would need a future, and the screen was the only way she knew to secure it. So she continued to work, to give herself to the cameras, to endure the heat of the lamps, even as the strain carved deeper lines into her face. She worked not only for herself now, but for him, for the promise of a life she might not be able to share, but could still provide. In this tension, between the frailty of her body and the devotion of her heart, lies the essence of Barbara La Marr's tragedy. She was a woman torn between the demands of fame and the desires of love, between the roles imposed upon her and the role she most wished to play. For all the world saw her as the vamp, the seductress. She herself wished only to be remembered as a mother who loved her child. The rocking chair creaked, the toy swayed gently, and for a moment there was peace, a stillness rare in her turbulent life. But the stillness could not last. Beyond the room, beyond the tender bond, the world pressed closer, the illnesses deepened, and the shadows lengthened. The chair rocked on, its slow rhythm merging with the image of a mirror covered by a cloth, as though even her reflection had grown too fragile to face. The rocking chair swayed softly, the toy resting upon it, until even that gentle rhythm seemed to fade into another silence, the silence of a mirror veiled by a cloth. It stood in the corner of a dim room, its surface hidden, as though the very act of seeing oneself had become unbearable. For Barbara La Marr, once celebrated as the woman too beautiful to live, there came a time when even her own reflection carried a sorrow too heavy to bear. Her health had begun its slow, unrelenting decline, and with it came the fading of the beauty upon which the world had feasted for so long. Illness had shadowed her for years, whispered about in studios, murmured in the columns, suspected by those who saw her falter on sets. Tuberculosis, nephritis, exhaustion, the diagnoses varied, but the truth was simpler and more cruel. Her body could no longer carry the life she had demanded of it. She grew thin, her face drawn, her once radiant eyes dulled by pain and fatigue. Yet she still painted her lips, still brushed her hair, still wrapped herself in gowns of silk and velvet, as though by sheer force of will she might preserve the illusion of the star she had once been. But the mirror, when uncovered, did not lie. And so, more often, it was left veiled, the cloth draped across its surface, a gesture both of denial and of mercy. She withdrew from the public eye more often in these years. Parties that once echoed with her laughter grew quieter without her. Nights once filled with champagne and music gave way to evenings of rest, though rest brought little peace. She remained in the gossip columns a figure of fascination, but now the fascination was tinged with cruelty. The papers whispered of her decline, of her frailty, of the once dazzling star reduced to shadow. And in this cruel chorus, one hears the darker truth of fame, that the world which exalts beauty also delights in its fading, that the same hands which applaud will later point in pity. On set, when she still managed to work, her colleagues saw the change. She could no longer endure the long hours, the hot lamps, the endless takes. She trembled, fainted, grew weaker with each attempt. Directors grew frustrated, producers wary. The roles offered to her diminished, and she, once at the center of the screen, began to slip to its edges. For Hollywood is merciless in its pursuit of the new, and there were always younger faces, fresher beauties, ready to step into the light. Barbara, once the symbol of irresistible allure, now watched as the spotlight turned elsewhere. It was perhaps the cruelest cut of all, to be present, to be alive, yet already forgotten. And yet, even in her decline, there was something in her presence that could not be erased. Those who visited her spoke of her spirit, still burning beneath the fragility of her body. She spoke with wit, with charm, with flashes of the radiance that had once captivated the world. The beauty might fade, the body might weaken, but the soul remained fierce, unwilling to surrender entirely. Perhaps this was why the mirror remained covered, not because she had ceased to exist, but because she wished to be remembered not as she had become, but as she had been. Her son, still young, remained the center of her devotion. She clung to him in these years, pouring into him the love that her body no longer had the strength to express in any other form. In his presence, she found purpose, even as illness drained her. She wrote of him, spoke of him, cherished him as the one part of her life untouched by scandal, the one love that was unshaken by her decline. The world might turn its gaze elsewhere, but he looked at her not as the vamp, not as the scandalous star, but simply as mother. And in that gaze, perhaps, she found the reflection she could still bear, even if the mirror remained shrouded. But the decline was relentless. Tuberculosis ravages slowly, stealing breath, weakening the body day by day. Nephritis wears away its strength, leaving fatigue that no rest can heal. Barbara fought both, but even her fierce spirit could not overcome them. She grew thinner, weaker, until her very presence seemed like a shadow of itself. The gown still shimmered, the jewels still sparkled, but beneath them, the woman was fading. Those who saw her in these final years often spoke of the contrast, the dazzling trappings of stardom wrapped around a body, frail as glass. And yet, she did not entirely withdraw. She appeared when she could, still smiled for cameras, still gave what remained of herself to the world that had both adored and destroyed her. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to surrender fully, even as the end approached. But in the quiet moments, the truth could not be denied. The mirror stood veiled, the cloth heavy with silence, the reflection it hid too painful to face. There is a haunting image in this part of her story, a room dimly lit, a mirror covered, a woman once radiant now seated in stillness, her son's toy resting nearby, her breath shallow. Outside, Hollywood continued to whirl, studios thriving, parties glittering, stars rising, but within time slowed, and the weight of decline pressed ever closer. And yet, even in this shadow, one senses not only tragedy, but a strange kind of beauty. For beauty is not only in radiance, in youth, in strength. There is beauty also in endurance, in the quiet dignity of a woman facing the end of her own legend with grace. Barbara La Marr, too beautiful to live, was also too fierce to surrender without leaving behind the memory of her spirit. The cloth hung over the mirror, heavy and unmoving, until at last the light dimmed and the room fell silent. And from that silence rose another sound, faint but unmistakable, the dimming of stage lights, their glow fading one by one until the stage itself lay in darkness. The mirror lay veiled, the cloth heavy across its surface, and from that silence came another fading image, the dimming of stage lights, one by one, until their glow dwindled into shadows. Yet before those lights were extinguished entirely, Barbara La Marr stood within their radiance once more, giving the last of herself to the screen that had both exalted and consumed her. These were her final performances, and in them she seemed to pour all that remained of her spirit, as though she knew they were both a confession and a farewell. Films such as The Eternal Struggle and The Hero captured her in these final years, and though her body was frail, her presence remained luminous. The screen has a strange mercy. It preserves an image even when the truth behind it falters. Audiences who watched her in those roles saw not a woman weakened by illness, but a figure of allure and depth, her gestures imbued with a haunting power. The camera, unblinking, caught her in moments where the line between performance and reality blurred, Was she acting sorrow or simply revealing her own? Was she portraying longing or confessing it? In those final films, the distinction no longer mattered. The roles and the woman had fused, and what the world saw was both story and truth, both character and confession. There was a fragility in her movements now, a delicacy that had not been present in her earlier roles. Where once she strode boldly across the screen, now she seemed to float, her steps lighter, her gestures slower, as though each movement cost her effort. Yet within that fragility lay a new depth. The audience felt it, sensed the weight beneath her beauty. She was not merely the vamp or the seductress. She was a woman carrying sorrow, a woman who had lived too much and endured too much. The films became, in a way, portraits of her own soul, caught in the final moments before it slipped into shadow. On set, those who worked with her noticed the change. She arrived thinner, paler, her energy fleeting. Breaks were frequent, her breath shallow. At times she could not complete a scene without pausing, without leaning upon a chair or against a wall. Yet when the camera rolled, something remarkable happened. She gathered herself, summoned a strength that seemed to come from the depths of her will, and delivered performances that left even hardened crew members silent. It was as though she poured what little life remained in her directly into the lens, offering herself fully without reserve, knowing she might not have another chance. There is something both noble and tragic in this. Noble, because it reveals her devotion to her craft, her refusal to surrender even as her body betrayed her. Tragic because each performance seemed to drain her further, leaving her weaker, closer to the end. To watch those films now is to witness not only an actress at work, but a woman writing her own elegy with gestures and glances, her beauty already edged with mortality. The studios, ever pragmatic, were aware of her decline. They knew she could not carry on much longer, and yet they pressed her still, for the allure of her name, for the draw of her face upon posters. Hollywood has always demanded sacrifice, and Barbara gave hers without complaint, though it hastened her downfall. She may have known this, but what choice did she have? To stop was to vanish, and she had spent her whole life running from invisibility. Better, perhaps, to burn brightly to the end than to fade into silence while the reel still spun. Audiences, too, sensed something of this. Though they could not know the full truth of her illness, they felt the weight in her performances. Letters poured into studios praising her depth, her sincerity, her haunting presence. She was admired not only for her beauty, but for something less easily defined, something that seemed to touch the soul. In this, perhaps, she achieved what she had always longed for, to be remembered not only as a face, but as an artist, as a woman whose presence carried meaning. Yet once the films were finished, once the lights dimmed and the cameras ceased, the silence returned. The applause did not follow her home. Instead, there was only the weight of exhaustion, the struggle to breathe, the loneliness of a star already fading from the heavens she had once commanded. She withdrew further, her world shrinking to rooms dimly lit, curtains drawn, the mirror still veiled. The child's laughter, the soft rocking of a chair, became her only solace. Fame remained outside, still speaking her name, but within, she was already preparing for departure. There is a particular sadness in watching those final films today, knowing what they represent. They are not simply performances, they are farewells. In each glance, each pause, one senses the awareness of mortality, the recognition that beauty cannot outlast time, that desire cannot defeat illness. They are beautiful, haunting, but also unbearably fragile, like flowers pressed into a book, their color preserved even as their scent is gone. The stage lights dimmed, one by one, until the screen itself seemed to fall into darkness. And in that darkness lingered the hush that follows a performance too intimate to applaud, a silence heavy with the knowledge that it was both ending and elegy. The lights faded, the room stilled, and beyond the closed door lay only silence, heavy and unmoving, like the air of a house where the door has just been shut against the world. The stage lights dimmed, one by one, until the world beyond the curtain fell to darkness, and with that darkness there came the sound of a door closing, slow and final. It was not slammed in anger, nor swung open with anticipation, but drawn shut against the noise of the world, leaving only the hush of rooms where silence clings like dust. Within those rooms, Barbara La Marr began to live more in seclusion, withdrawing from the circles that had once defined her, while outside the world of Hollywood carried on with its restless whirl, scarcely pausing to notice when one star slipped into shadow. The closed door marked a threshold. Beyond it, the parties glittered on, the champagne still bubbled, the studios continued their work, and the headlines moved to fresher scandals. Within, there was only the quiet rhythm of her own breath, uneven and often shallow, the footsteps of nurses, the laughter of her child. Fame, so insistent once, faded at the edges, replaced by the reality of illness that could no longer be disguised beneath rouge or gowns. She had fought to remain radiant before cameras, to defy the frailty that consumed her, but here, behind the door, there was no longer need for pretense. Those who visited her in this period spoke of the contrast. In public memory, she was still the vamp, the seductress, the woman too beautiful to live. In the private rooms where she now dwelled, she was pale, fragile, her voice softened by exhaustion. Yet even diminished, she retained a kind of presence, a light that seemed to flicker stubbornly even as the flame weakened. Her wit had not deserted her, nor her charm. Visitors found themselves both saddened and moved, sensing that they were in the company of someone who had lived with an intensity few could imagine, and who now carried that intensity into decline with a strange dignity. The newspapers, when they mentioned her at all, did so with the cruelty of distance. They spoke of her illness, of her fading, sometimes with pity, sometimes with scorn. Hollywood was quick to forget its stars once they could no longer perform, and Barbara was no exception. She had been an emblem of scandal. Now she was reduced to whispers of decline, her once luminous face evoked in the past tense. To the world she was already gone, even before she truly departed. And yet, within her quiet rooms, life continued in its smaller rhythms, moments of tenderness with her son, moments of reflection, moments where the closed door protected her from the gaze that had both adored and destroyed her. It is tempting to imagine her in those days, sitting by a window, gazing out at a world she could no longer join. Perhaps she watched the movement of people in the street, the glow of studio lights in the distance, the endless motion of a city that had little time for memory. Did she feel bitterness, watching from the shadows the world that had once celebrated her? Or did she feel relief to be hidden at last from the relentless gaze? Perhaps she felt both in alternating currents as the days passed into nights and the nights into days. There is a quiet tragedy in this retreat, for Barbara had lived so fiercely in the public eye, had given so much of herself to being seen, that withdrawal was itself a kind of death before death. For one whose life had been performance, silence must have been both balm and torment. In silence there is rest, but there is also the echo of all that has been lost. The applause, the laughter, the music of parties, all of it grew distant until only memory remained. And memory, unlike applause, is never loud enough to fill the silence. Still, she had her son, and in him she found reason to endure. His presence gave her days a rhythm more real than the false cycles of fame. She held him, told him stories, sought to give him a love steadier than the life she had known. He was her anchor, her tether, the one part of her existence untouched by scandal. In caring for him, she perhaps cared also for herself, reminding herself that she was more than an image fading from the screen. She was mother, and in that role she found dignity even as the rest of her life slipped into shadow. Yet the decline pressed on. Tuberculosis is merciless, a slow thief of breath, and nephritis wears away at the body with equal cruelty. Each day brought new weakness, new pain, new reminders that the end was approaching. Friends came less often, not from indifference, but from the discomfort of watching a star fade. Fame attracts crowds. Decline leaves only a few. The door remained closed more often, not only to shield her from the world, but to shield the world from her. Outside, the films she had made still played, her image still glowing upon the screens. Audiences saw her as she had been, luminous, radiant, untouched by decline. In theaters, she was eternal, even as in life she diminished. The paradox was cruel. She was both immortal and fading, both preserved in light and dissolving in flesh. To be a star is to live in two worlds at once, and in these final years, Barbara inhabited them more painfully than most. The closed door, the veiled mirror, the silence of the room, all spoke of retreat, of endings. Yet within that silence, there was still life, still love, still the stubborn flicker of a spirit unwilling to vanish entirely. She had lived too fiercely to surrender without leaving some final trace, and even in seclusion, she carried with her the aura of a legend. Those who saw her in these days remembered her not only for her frailty, but for her courage, for the grace with which she bore the cruelty of both illness and memory. The door remained shut, heavy against the noise outside, and then, one evening, a shadow passed across the threshold, lingering for a moment, neither wholly inside nor wholly gone, as though to remind her that the next passage would not be through a door, but into the unknown. The door remained closed against the world, the silence within unbroken, until one evening a shadow passed across the threshold. It lingered there, neither fully inside nor entirely absent, a reminder that even in seclusion, presence and absence could meet in uneasy balance. For Barbara La Marr, these shadows became companions of a sort, the shadows of friends who visited, the shadows of those who once loved her but no longer came, the shadows of memory itself, drifting in and out of her dim rooms. In these final months, when her body weakened further and the world moved on without her, friendship became both her solace and her sorrow. She had been, in her brightest years, surrounded by admirers. At parties her laughter had rung out, and men had vied for her glance, while women had gathered around her glow. But admiration is not loyalty, and when illness stole her radiance, many of those companions vanished. The crowds who had once pressed close at her side melted into the background of Hollywood's restless tide, seeking new stars to orbit, new stories to adorn themselves with. Fame attracts like a flame, but it does not nourish. When the flame dims, the moths drift elsewhere, yet not all departed. A few remained, steadfast in ways that surprised even her. Old colleagues visited her bedside, speaking gently, recalling the days when the cameras turned endlessly upon her. Some brought flowers, their scent filling the dim rooms with brief brightness. Others brought laughter, trying to coax her back into the world of the living, if only for an hour, and still others simply sat beside her, silent, knowing that sometimes the greatest gift one can give is presence without demand. These friends, fewer in number but deeper in loyalty, offered her a different kind of recognition, one not based on scandal or glamour, but on humanity. The contrast was sharp. For every loyal friend, there were many more who stayed away, whether from discomfort, fear, or indifference. Some could not bear to see her diminished, unable to reconcile the woman in the bed with the goddess of the screen. Others simply no longer cared, their interest having been in the spectacle, not the soul. Barbara, who had once been at the center of Hollywood's fascination, now found herself at its margins, visited by a handful and forgotten by the many. It was a cruel lesson, one that many stars would later learn. Fame is not friendship. Applause is not love. Her loneliness grew, though she tried to mask it. To her son she smiled, spoke tenderly, played at moments of joy. To visitors, she offered wit, recalling the sparkle that had once defined her. But when the room was empty, when the child slept and the friends had gone, she faced the silence alone. In those hours, the shadows lengthened, and she must have asked herself the questions that haunt all who have been adored and abandoned. Did they ever love me? Or did they love only the image I carried? Did they see me, or only the mask I wore? And when the mask slipped, was there anything left for them to hold? The shadow across the threshold became a symbol of this uncertainty. Each knock upon the door carried with it the question, who remains and who has gone? Each visitor reminded her of the many who no longer came. Each absence deepened the quiet, and yet within that quiet perhaps there was also clarity. For in decline illusions fall away, and what remains are truths unadorned. Barbara may have discovered in her loneliness the difference between those who loved her for her radiance and those who loved her for herself. It was a painful discovery, but perhaps also a freeing one. Hollywood itself rarely looked back. The gossip columns, when they mentioned her, spoke of her fading beauty, her tragic decline, her imminent death. Rarely did they speak of her artistry, her writing, her wit. Rarely did they acknowledge her tenderness as a mother. To the world she was still the vamp, the scandal, the girl too beautiful to live. They had no language for her loneliness, no interest in her quiet truths. The typewriters clattered on, indifferent, while she lay in stillness, listening to the shadow move across her floor. And yet, within the narrowing circle of her life, there was also a strange intimacy. The friends who remained knew her more deeply than those who had adored her at a distance. They saw her not as an image, but as a woman, frail, suffering, yet still luminous in her own way. Perhaps it was in these final relationships that she found the kind of love she had always sought. Love not for her beauty, not for her scandal, but for her being. If so, it came late, but not too late. For love, even fleeting, even at the end, is still love. Her son, too, remained by her side, the truest companion of all. In his laughter, in his small hands reaching for hers, she found the reflection she could no longer find in the mirror. He saw her not as fading, not as fallen, but simply as mother. And in that gaze, all shadows dissolved. For a child's love does not waver with illness, does not diminish with decline. It is steady, unguarded, complete. In him she found the proof that even if the world forgot, she had not lived in vain. Still, the shadows across the threshold lengthened. Visitors came less often. The air in her rooms grew heavier, the silence deeper. Her world contracted to the space between her bed, her son's laughter and the dim light through the curtains. Outside, the city bustled, indifferent. Inside, time slowed, each day measured not in triumphs or scandals, but in breaths, taken and endured. The shadow lingered at the threshold, silent and patient, as though waiting to step further in, waiting to claim its place fully within the room. The shadow lingered at the threshold, silent and patient, waiting for the moment when it would no longer need to hover, but could step fully into the room. In these final months of Barbara La Marr's life, death became not an abrupt visitor, but a steady companion, drawing nearer with each passing day, each shallow breath, each moment of weariness that left her unable to rise from her bed. She was only 29 years old, yet her body bore the weight of decades, worn thin by illness, excess, and the relentless demands of the life she had lived. Doctors came and went, their diagnoses varying, their prognoses uncertain. Tuberculosis, nephritis, exhaustion. They gave names to the slow unraveling of her strength, but names could not restore it. Medicine offered little in those days, and for a woman so weakened, even rest was no true cure. She had fought too long against her own frailty, refusing to surrender when directors pressed her, when parties beckoned, when her own restless spirit drove her into the night. But now, within the quiet of her rooms, she could fight no longer. The shadow had stepped closer, and though she resisted in spirit, her body betrayed her. Friends who still visited spoke of her thinness, her face drawn, her beauty transformed into something more fragile, almost otherworldly, yet even diminished. She carried a presence that touched those who saw her. There was still fire in her eyes, though softer now, tempered by suffering. She spoke with quiet humor, with tenderness, with a kind of acceptance that suggested she knew her time was short. Perhaps she had known it all along. For what else could the phrase, "too beautiful to live," mean, if not prophecy, disguised as praise? Her son was never far from her side. To him she gave what love remained, her hands stroking his hair, her voice murmuring stories, her gaze fixed upon him with an intensity that seemed to draw her last reserves of strength. He was her anchor in these final days, the one reason she endured the pain, the weakness, the indignity of illness. In him she saw the continuation of her own existence, the proof that her life, however brief, would echo beyond her. When she looked at him, the shadow seemed to pause at the threshold, unable to enter fully, held back by the bond between mother and child. But shadows do not retreat forever. They wait and they advance. And as her illness worsened, Barbara began to slip further from the world outside. The curtains were drawn, the door remained closed, and even her most loyal friends came less often, daunted by the sorrow of her decline. Hollywood, which had once adored her, had already moved on, its lights fixed upon newer faces. The papers still mentioned her from time to time, but now only as a figure of tragedy, a cautionary tale. The star who had burned so brightly was now fading, and the world, ever hungry for novelty, had little patience for the spectacle of decline. In the stillness of her final days, there was both suffering and a strange kind of peace. Suffering, because her body weakened with each hour, her breath grew more labored, her strength slipped away. Peace, because at last she no longer had to perform, no longer had to mask her pain or adorn her decline with jewels and gowns. Within the walls of her room, she could simply be a woman, a mother, a soul preparing for departure. For someone who had lived so much of her life in roles, perhaps this final stripping away was a release. She spoke at times of her regrets, though always lightly, as though she did not wish to burden those around her. She regretted the restlessness, the scandals, the nights that had stolen her health. Yet she did not regret her son, nor the love she had given him. He was, as she had once said, her true romance, her lasting joy. In him she found redemption, and for him she endured the slow approach of death with dignity. If the shadow must enter, it would not take from her the love she had found in those brief years of motherhood. Her final decline was slow, each day blending into the next, marked by weakness, by silence, by the growing presence of the shadow at her side. The nurses who tended her spoke of her gentleness, of her grace even in pain. They marveled that someone so long associated with scandal could face suffering with such quiet strength. But perhaps it was not surprising, for beneath the roles, beneath the masks, beneath the glamour, there had always been a woman of depth, a woman whose spirit was not defined by headlines, but by the fierce will that had carried her through a life of turbulence. As her breath grew shallower, as her body weakened further, the shadow at the threshold finally stepped into the room. It did not come with violence or suddenness, but with inevitability, like the setting of the sun, like the dimming of lights after a final performance. Barbara La Marr, too beautiful to live, lay in stillness, her son nearby, her friends and nurses at her side, and with a final breath she surrendered to the darkness that had hovered so long at her door. The clock upon the wall ticked softly, its rhythm slowing as though marking her departure with reverence. Outside, the world continued as it always had, indifferent, unaware. But within those rooms, silence fell heavy, and those who witnessed it knew they had seen the end of a legend, the final curtain drawn upon a life that had burned too brightly to endure. And from that silence there arose a new sound, low and murmurous, the voices of a crowd gathering, whispering, mourning, for even in death she could not escape the gaze of the world. The shadow at last entered fully, and silence lay across the room like a shroud. But beyond that silence, another sound began to stir. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, the murmuring of voices carried upon the air, swelling as words spread outward, street by street, city by city. News had reached Hollywood and then the wider world. Barbara La Marr was dead at 29. The crowds that had once gathered at theaters now gathered in sorrow, whispering to one another that the girl too beautiful to live had indeed slipped away, leaving behind only reels of film, fragments of memory, and the haunting aura of a legend extinguished too soon. The shock was real, even in a city accustomed to scandal and loss. Stars had risen and fallen before, but Barbara's death struck differently. Perhaps it was her youth, perhaps her beauty, perhaps the sense that she had burned too brightly, too recklessly, that made the loss feel inevitable and yet unbearable. Newspapers that had once chronicled her scandals now carried headlines of her passing, often written with tones of elegy. Columns described the frailty of her final months, the devotion to her son, the brilliance of her career cut short. Some wrote of her as a cautionary tale, others as a tragic heroine, but all agreed that Hollywood had lost one of its brightest, most troubled stars. Her funeral drew crowds who pressed close to glimpse her one last time, though many had never known her in life. The casket lay open, her face pale, her body adorned with flowers, and mourners whispered that even in death she was beautiful. Photographers captured images of the service, flashes punctuating the solemnity, for even grief was not free from spectacle in Hollywood. The press, which had once chased her through nights of excess, now lingered to record her departure, as though in death she belonged not to herself, but to the myth she had become. Among those present were colleagues from the studios, actors and actresses, who had worked beside her, who remembered her not only as a star, but as a woman of wit, charm, and fierce will. They spoke quietly of her artistry, of her writing, of the dedication she had shown even when her body faltered. Some wept openly, others stood in silence, but all carried the weight of knowing they had witnessed a flame extinguished too soon. The crowd was large, the flowers abundant. Yet within it all there was an emptiness, for no gathering, no ritual, could truly capture the paradox of her life or the sorrow of her death. Her son, too young to fully understand, was there in the arms of guardians. For him, the day was a blur of faces, of flowers, of murmuring voices. In years to come, he would remember his mother not through that service, but through the stories told of her, the films she had left behind, and the love she had given him in the brief time they shared. For Barbara, whatever else her life had been, motherhood remained her truest role, the one she cherished most deeply. In her final words, she had spoken of him as her greatest joy, the proof that even in tragedy there was love. The public, hearing of her death, responded with both sorrow and fascination. Letters poured into studios, into newspapers, into fan clubs, expressing grief, admiration, regret. Some spoke of her as a goddess, others as a cautionary figure undone by excess, but all agreed that she would not be forgotten. The phrase, "the girl too beautiful to live," appeared again and again, as though the world sought in that epithet some explanation for her fate, some way to make sense of the senseless. Beauty, they seemed to say, had been both her blessing and her doom, a gift too great to endure. Yet one wonders, beneath these words of mourning, what truths remained unseen. Was she truly destroyed by beauty, or by the relentless gaze that reduced her to it? Was she undone by her own recklessness, or by a world that demanded she live recklessly to remain adored? In death, as in life, Barbara La Marr remained a mystery, a figure half real, half legend, whose story could never be fully told. The murmurs of the crowd echoed this uncertainty, carrying not only grief but questions left unresolved. As the funeral procession moved slowly through the streets, the sound of wheels against pavement mingled with the whispers of the mourners. Flowers fell, petals scattered, voices hushed. Hollywood itself seemed to pause, if only for a moment, to acknowledge the passing of one of its own. Then, as always, the city moved on, its lights burning, its cameras rolling, its scandals unfolding anew. But for those who had seen her, who had watched her upon the screen or read of her in the papers, there remained a hollow space, the lingering sense that something rare and fragile had been lost. Her death was more than the end of a life. It was the sealing of a legend. For in dying young, she ensured that she would be remembered not as an aging star, but as the eternal vamp, the eternal beauty, the eternal tragedy. She became, in the eyes of the world, frozen in youth, forever luminous, forever lost. The mourning crowd may not have known it, but they were not only grieving a woman, they were consecrating a myth. The murmurs of grief swelled and faded, the crowd dispersed, the flowers wilted, but the weight of her departure lingered in the air. And in that lingering silence, heavy after the voices had gone, there was the faint sense of petals falling still, piling upon her grave until the weight of blossoms became indistinguishable from the weight of memory. The murmurs of the crowd dwindled, footsteps fading, voices softening until only the flowers remained, heaped high upon her grave. Their scent hung heavy in the air, mingling with the damp earth, an offering both of devotion and of farewell. Roses, lilies, wreaths of laurel, garlands carefully arranged and hastily thrown, each bloom a fragment of grief, each petal a silent word unspoken. The weight of flowers pressed down upon the soil, and beneath that soil lay the woman the world had called too beautiful to live. It was here, in this ritual of mourning, that Barbara La Marr's story passed from life into memory. Funerals are not only for the dead, they are also for the living, for those who must make sense of absence. In that gathering, where friends, colleagues, and strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, there was more than sorrow. There was awe, curiosity, a strange fascination that lingers when someone departs too soon. Some came to honor her, others simply to witness the spectacle of her passing. Hollywood had always blurred the line between grief and performance, and even in death, Barbara could not escape the spotlight. The cameras were there, clicking, capturing the bowed heads, the tear-streaked faces, the casket covered in blossoms. Her funeral, like her life, became part ritual, part theater, both sacred and public. Among the mourners were those who had truly known her, the friends who had stayed when others left, the colleagues who remembered her as more than scandal, the few who had glimpsed her as mother, as writer, as woman. Their grief was quieter, heavier, not for the legend, but for the person. They remembered her wit, her generosity, the way she could light a room with laughter, the way she could move others with her eyes. They mourned not the vamp, not the scandalous star, but Barbara, fragile, restless, radiant. For them, the flowers upon her grave were not only offerings to a legend, but symbols of love lost, of a friend gone too soon. The funeral rites followed their course, prayers spoken, hymns sung, words of remembrance offered. Yet within those formalities there was a current of something deeper, something unspoken, the recognition that beauty, fame, and desire are fleeting, and that even the brightest flame can be extinguished in an instant. The crowd, for all its differences, shared this knowledge in that moment. They stood in silence as the final words were spoken, the air heavy with the scent of flowers and the weight of impermanence. For her son, the ritual was beyond comprehension. Too young to grasp the full meaning, he saw only the people, the flowers, the solemn faces. In years to come, he would learn what the day had meant, would be told of the mother he had lost, the legend she had become. But in that moment, he was a child among strangers, his life already marked by the absence of the woman who had loved him most fiercely. It is perhaps the deepest tragedy of all, that the love which had given her strength in her final days could not remain with him in the years to follow. The world beyond the cemetery moved on quickly, as it always does. Theaters continued to play her films, but soon newer releases replaced them. Columns that once chronicled her scandals and then her death turned their attention to other stars, other stories. Hollywood had paused to mourn, but only briefly. Its machinery of glamour and gossip could not be stilled for long. Yet even as it moved on, something of Barbara lingered. Her image, preserved in film, remained. Her name, spoken in whispers, carried weight. Her story, both true and mythic, began to take shape in the collective imagination. For legends are not built only in life. They are also constructed in death. And Barbara's death, at 29, sealed her story in a way no life could have. Had she lived longer, grown older, faded from the screen, she might have been remembered differently. But by dying young, by leaving while still radiant in memory, she became eternal in a way few could. The weight of flowers upon her grave was also the weight of legend pressing into place, fixing her forever as the girl too beautiful to live. In the weeks after her funeral, stories of her life spread with renewed fervor. Some recalled her beauty, others her scandals, still others her generosity. Each tale added to the mosaic, some true, some exaggerated, some invented. She became less a woman than a symbol, less a person than a myth. And as myths often do, hers grew beyond her control, carried by voices that never knew her, shaped by imaginations that had only glimpsed her on the screen. Yet beneath the myth, beneath the flowers, there remained the reality of a woman who had lived fiercely and loved deeply, who had sought permanence in a world that offered none. That reality, though quieter, was not erased. It lingered in the memories of those who had sat beside her bed, who had heard her laughter, who had seen her tenderness with her son. It lingered, too, in the films she had left behind, where her eyes still flicker with life, where her gestures still carry the echo of her restless soul. The flowers upon her grave withered in time, their petals curling, their scent fading. But memory does not fade so easily. In the silence after the funeral, when the crowds had dispersed and the blossoms had begun to decay, there remained the heavy presence of absence, the knowledge that something rare and fragile had been lost. The grave lay quiet, yet above it the weight of memory pressed on, like blossoms that never cease to fall. And from that silence, from that fading perfume of flowers, there came another sound, faint yet insistent, the crackle of reels of film, celluloid spooling in dark rooms, her image still alive upon the screen, even as her body lay in the earth. The flowers withered upon the grave, their petals curling back into the soil, their perfume dissolving into the air. And in the silence that followed, there arose another sound, faint at first, then growing steady, the crackle of reels of film turning in darkened rooms. In those reels, Barbara La Marr lived still, luminous as ever, her eyes filled with secrets, her movements slow and deliberate, her beauty preserved as though untouched by time. Audiences sat in theaters, the projectors whirring, the light flickering, and there she was, radiant upon the screen, even as beneath the earth her body had already grown still. Thus began the transformation of Barbara from woman into legend, from a restless, fragile soul into a myth enshrined in the golden haze of memory. Legends are born not only of lives lived, but of lives cut short, and Barbara's death at 29 ensured that she would be remembered in a way different from those who grew old, who faded gradually from the screen. She became frozen in time, eternal in youth, forever beautiful. Critics and writers revisited her story, recounting the details of her scandals, her marriages, her excess, her frailty, weaving them into a narrative of inevitable downfall. The phrase, "too beautiful to live," became her epitaph, repeated again and again, as though beauty itself were a kind of fatal condition. In those words was both admiration and absolution, a way of explaining her decline without confronting the harsher truths of exhaustion, addiction, and a world that had consumed her. The legend that grew around her was shaped as much by imagination as by memory. Some recalled her generosity, her laughter, her writing. Others spoke only of her wildness, her excesses, her scandals. Myths flourished, that she had been married countless times, that she had loved recklessly without regret, that she had lived as though she knew she had little time. Each retelling added to the myth, polishing it like a stone until the woman within it grew harder to see. Yet perhaps this was fitting, for Barbara herself had always been a master of reinvention, always living half in reality, half in performance. In death, the performance became eternal. Her films, too, took on new weight. Audiences watched them not as passing entertainments, but as relics, fragments of a life already lost. Each glance, each smile, each gesture seemed imbued with poignancy, as though she had left behind confessions hidden within her roles. Film has this strange magic. It preserves the illusion of life, even when life itself has ended. Watching her upon the screen, one could almost believe she was still alive, still luminous, still breathing. The reels spun on, crackling softly, and in their flicker, Barbara endured. Hollywood, which forgets so quickly, did not entirely forget her. Though new stars rose and new scandals filled the headlines, her name remained. Writers evoked her as a symbol of the silent era's dangerous glamour, as a cautionary tale of beauty undone, as a myth of passion too fierce to endure. In the decades that followed, retrospectives would recall her, scholars would write of her, and film enthusiasts would search out the surviving reels where her presence lingered. Each generation rediscovered her with the same mixture of awe and sorrow, marveling at her beauty, mourning her brevity. But legends are double-edged. To be remembered as myth is to be both immortal and distorted. Barbara the legend was forever the vamp, the seductress, the scandalous star. Barbara the woman, restless child, ink-stained writer, tender mother, was less often remembered. The complexity of her existence was smoothed away in favor of a story the world preferred, a dazzling star who lived too fiercely and died too soon. Yet even within the myth, fragments of the truth endured, glimpses of the soul behind the mask, flashes of the woman who had longed for more than applause. Her son carried her memory in a different way. To him, she was not legend or myth, not vamp or scandal, but mother. In his heart, her legacy was love, not tragedy. He spoke of her tenderness, her devotion, her strength, even in illness. Through him, another version of Barbara endured, quieter, truer, unseen by the world, but no less real. Between the myth of Hollywood and the memory of her child lay the full measure of her existence, the star and the woman, the beauty and the soul, the legend and the mother. As years passed, the reels grew brittle, the film fragile, threatened by decay. Some of her work was lost, other fragments preserved with care. Archivists and enthusiasts decades later worked to rescue what remained, to keep alive the flickering image of the woman who had once captivated the silent screen. Each rediscovered frame was another petal upon her grave, another gesture of remembrance, another acknowledgement that she had not been forgotten. And though time had blurred her story, the legend of Barbara La Marr continued to glow, fragile yet enduring, like the light of a star that has long since burned out, but whose radiance still reaches us across the void. The reels crackled on, their light flickering against darkened walls, her image moving still, her beauty untarnished, her presence eternal. Yet even as the light preserved her, silence lingered behind it, reminding us that the woman herself was gone, her life reduced to fragments, her truth half hidden within the folds of myth. And as the reels spun, one by one they began to crumble, the celluloid fragile, breaking, turning to dust, until only silence remained again, heavy and unbroken, like a candle guttering in a darkened room. The reels crackled, then faltered, their fragile celluloid breaking apart into dust, and in that sudden hush there was only the image of a candle guttering in a darkened room. Its flame trembled, leaned to one side, flared briefly, then steadied once more, fragile yet insistent. So too does memory linger, sometimes fading, sometimes returning with unexpected brightness, refusing entirely to be extinguished. And in that wavering light, the figure of Barbara La Marr continues to live, not as the woman of flesh who walked through scandal and sorrow, but as a presence carried by story, by recollection, by the soft murmurs of those who still speak her name. Her son grew older, carrying with him both the love she had given and the weight of her absence. He became Don Gallery, finding his own place in the world, yet never forgetting the mother who had cradled him with such fierce tenderness, even as her own body failed. Through him, a different Barbara was preserved, not the star upon the screen nor the scandal of the tabloids, but the woman who had whispered lullabies, who had kissed his hair, who had declared him her truest romance. This private memory ran alongside the public legend, quieter but no less enduring, a candle burning steadily even as the grand torches of myth flared and dimmed. Hollywood, as decades passed, continued its restless cycle of stars rising and falling, scandals blossoming and fading. Yet Barbara's name remained among those who died too soon, those whose beauty and tragedy fused into something eternal. She was spoken of in the same breath as other figures of fleeting brilliance, remembered not for longevity but for intensity, for the way her life seemed too condensed, too fierce to survive. Scholars of film wrote of her allure, historians of Hollywood recalled her scandals, archivists treasured the reels that still preserved her image. She had become part of the tapestry of the silent era, woven in gold and shadow, her story inseparable from the myth of Hollywood itself. And yet, when we look closely, when we listen beyond the applause and the gossip, we find something more subtle, more human. We find a restless child in Yakima, gazing at the stars, wandering from home in search of something unnamed. We find a young woman taking new names, reinventing herself again and again, seeking freedom in roles and romances that never quite held. We find an artist, ink-stained fingers shaping stories, yearning to be more than a face upon a screen. We find a mother, holding her son with tenderness, finding in him the permanence she had long sought. And we find a woman undone, not simply by beauty or scandal, but by frailty, by exhaustion, by a world that demanded more than any one soul could give. Perhaps this is the truth behind the epithet, too beautiful to live. It was not beauty itself that destroyed her, but the gaze it drew, the expectations it imposed, the restlessness it provoked within her. Beauty became both her crown and her burden, lifting her to the heights of fame while pressing her down into decline. And yet, even in this paradox, there is a kind of poetry, for to live intensely, however briefly, is its own form of eternity. Barbara's life, though short, left an imprint deeper than many who lived twice as long. Her flame guttered quickly, but the light it cast still flickers in memory. The candle in the dark wavered once more, its flame bending, then straightening, then bending again, as though reluctant to vanish. Around it, the shadows deepened, yet the small circle of light it cast was enough to hold back the void. So it is with memory. We hold onto fragments, onto stories, onto images preserved in reels of film and in whispered recollections. and through them, the lost are never entirely gone. Barbara La Marr, though her body rests beneath withered flowers, continues to move across screens, to live in her son's remembrance, to linger in the imagination of all who hear her tale. And so, as we close this story, we do not close it with finality, for legends never end. They fade, they return, they shift in shape, but they do not vanish. Barbara's story remains, drifting across time like the faint scent of lilies left long ago upon a grave, like the echo of applause in a theater that has long since grown silent, like the tremble of a candle flame that refuses to die. May you, dear listener, carry with you not only the image of the vamp, the scandalous star, the girl too beautiful to live, but also the memory of the woman behind the mask, the restless dreamer, the writer of words, the mother who loved. For it is in remembering her in full, in both light and shadow, that we honor her truly. The candle flickers once more, then steadies, its glow soft upon the air. Outside, the night is still, and in that stillness the story rests, leaving us with silence, with memory, with the fragile light of a flame that endures.